The first sound was not the wind. It was wood breaking. Ethan Caldwell woke to a deep cracking groan that did not belong in a safe house. Snow slammed against the cabin walls like fists. The roof above him shuddered again, and a thin line split across the main beam, spreading slow and steady like a wound opening in flesh. Frost drifted down from the rafters. The stove still burned, but the heat felt weak now, almost embarrassed against the roar outside. He stood very still in the dim lantern light and listened. The prairie was not howling, it was screaming. Another crack. Ethan did not curse. He did not panic. He simply turned toward the back wall of his cabin, walked to a section that looked solid and ordinary and pulled it aside. Behind it was darkness and a narrow tunnel sloping into the earth. He had maybe an hour before the roof failed, maybe less. Outside, men who once laughed at him were fighting the same wind with nothing but logs and hope. Inside, Ethan Caldwell had a choice that no one else did. He grabbed his lantern and stepped underground. The tunnel was barely wide enough for his shoulders, 3 feet across, timber bracing every 2 feet to prevent collapse. The earth walls were packed tight, frozen hard as stone. He moved fast but careful. He had measured this tunnel dozens of times while building it. He knew exactly where his head would brush if he rushed. The temperature shifted within seconds. The wind noise faded, then vanished. At the bottom of the slope, the space opened into a room carved into the hillside behind the cabin, 12 feet wide, 15 feet deep, ceiling just under 7 feet. The walls were stacked sod blocks nearly 2 feet thick, pressed tight and layered for insulation. Heavy cottonwood beams supported the roof, which carried 3 feet of packed earth above it. The prairie storm could tear at the surface all it wanted. It would never reach here. Ethan set the lantern on a shelf and moved with purpose. He fed wood into the small sheet-iron stove in the corner and opened the draft carefully. The stovepipe ran up through a narrow vent shaft that angled sideways before reaching daylight, hidden behind a stone outcrop he had placed himself. The design forced wind to curve around it instead of driving straight down the pipe. Within minutes, warmth began to build. Not roaring heat, steady heat. The kind that stayed. He climbed back up the tunnel one last time. The roof beam groaned louder now. Snow weight and wind pressure worked together like hands trying to pry the structure apart. He grabbed blankets, a sack of dried beans, cured meat, flour, his rifle, and the small wooden box that held his wife's Bible. He made 3 fast trips. On the 4th trip, as he reached the tunnel entrance, the beam split with a sharp crack that echoed like a rifle shot. He did not wait to see more. He sealed the hidden wall behind him and went down for good. By morning, the cabin above had partially collapsed. He did not see it happen. He did not need to. The storm raged for 3 days. Down in the dugout, the air stayed near 40 degrees without much effort. The earth held its own warmth. Even when the outside temperature dropped past 30 below, the soil around him resisted the change. That was what most men never understood. Wood cabins fought the air. The earth did not. He fed the stove slowly. Small pieces, no waste. The room stayed still. No shaking beams, no drifting snow. On the 2nd day, he heard something through the vent shaft that froze him more than the wind ever could. A distant crash. Then another. Cabins failing. He closed his eyes but did not move. He had warned them. Months earlier, when he first started digging into the hillside, men from Cedar Bluff rode out to see what he was doing. They had stood in a half circle, boots muddy from thawing spring soil, watching him shovel clay and haul it in a wooden wheelbarrow he had built himself. At first, he told them it was a root cellar. That would have been normal, but root cellars did not require roof beams thick enough to hold a house. Root cellars did not need ventilation shafts carefully angled for wind resistance, and root cellars did not connect to the main cabin through a reinforced tunnel hidden behind a false wall. By April, rumors spread. Ethan Caldwell had lost his nerve. Ethan Caldwell was hiding from something. Ethan Caldwell was preparing for war. The truth was simpler and harder to accept. 4 winters on the prairie had taught him that a cabin could be strong and still fail. In January of '73, he burned half his firewood in 1 week during a deep freeze that never seemed to lift. Wind found the smallest cracks and pulled warmth out faster than the stove could replace it. He slept in his coat and still woke shaking. 2 winters later, drifting snow forced its way under his shingles during a night storm. He woke to frost forming inside his own walls. He survived both times because the weather broke, not because his shelter was enough. So he stopped trusting luck. Digging the dugout took him 3 months. He cut into the south-facing hillside where the slope was firm and high enough to avoid spring flooding. He tested soil by soaking samples in water to see how they held shape. He drove support stakes before removing deeper sections. He hauled timber from a stand of cottonwood near the creek and shaped each beam with hand tools. His hands bled that spring. His back burned each night. Neighbors passed by and shook their heads. They said a man with a solid cabin did not need a second one underground. They said visible improvements proved strength. Hiding something looked suspicious. He did not argue much. He simply kept digging. On the 4th day after the storm began, silence returned. He waited another full day before opening the passage. Snow blocked the upper entrance. He shoveled from inside, pushing upward until light broke through. The prairie looked flattened. Cabins leaned at strange angles. Chimneys lay broken. Drifts reached shoulder height. His own cabin had lost most of its roof. He stood there a long moment, breathing in air that felt like knives. Then he walked toward town. The walk to Cedar Bluff usually took 30 minutes. That morning it took nearly 2 hours. He found Samuel Harper's cabin first. The roof had caved inward. Snow filled the interior. He dug with his hands until they went numb. He found Samuel and his boy near the back wall, frozen together. Further down the ridge, 2 more homes had failed. Not every family died. Some survived in barns. One family carved a snow trench against their cabin wall and huddled there. But the dead outnumbered the living. By the time the storm was counted, 39 people in the county were gone. Most died when their roofs failed and they had nowhere else to go. When word spread that Ethan Caldwell had survived comfortably underground, the same men who mocked him came to stand at the edge of the hillside. They did not laugh this time. They studied the hidden entrance. They looked at the small vent disguised among rocks. They walked through the tunnel in silence. One man finally asked the question that mattered. "How deep did you dig?" "Deep enough to trust the earth more than the wind," Ethan said. That spring, 3 families began digging their own shelters. He helped them measure slopes. He warned them about drainage and vent placement. He told them not to dig in low ground. He showed them how to brace beams every 2 feet and how to angle stovepipes so wind could not push smoke back down. Some called it overreaction. Others called it wisdom learned the hard way. 5 years later, another hard winter came. 4 cabins failed. 4 families moved underground. No one died. Ethan Caldwell rebuilt his main cabin stronger than before, but he never filled in the dugout. He kept it stocked. He kept the tunnel clear. He hoped never to use it again. He did not need to, but every winter when the wind began to rise, he would rest a hand on the hidden wall and feel something most men on the prairie never felt. Options. People once thought his secret dugout cabin was madness. After the blizzard, they called it foresight. Today the hillside shows no sign that a second home once existed beneath it. The earth closed over it long ago. But the lesson remains simple and hard. Do not trust one layer between you and death. When wind can break wood, build where wind cannot reach. And if people laugh while you dig, keep digging. Because storms do not care what others think. Winter did not leave clean that year. The snow melted in uneven patches, exposing broken fences, split beams, and blackened timbers where stoves had burned too hot in panic. The prairie looked bruised. Men walked slower. Women spoke softer. Funerals stretched across 2 full weeks in Cedar Bluff, each grave dug through frozen ground that resisted every shovel strike. Ethan Caldwell stood at the edge of the cemetery and kept his hat in his hands. He did not speak much. There was nothing he could say that would bring back Samuel Harper or the Reinhardt children. What he felt was not pride. It was weight. After the burials, the questions began. They did not ask him if he had survived. Everyone knew he had. They asked how. He did not exaggerate. He explained the soil, the beams, the depth. He described how the earth held a steady temperature below frost line. He spoke of wind load on exposed roofs and how snow weight doubled when it packed and froze. He showed them the crack in his main beam, now lying on the ground like a broken limb. Some listened with open faces. Others listened with resentment. One man said what many were thinking. "If you knew cabins could fail like that, why did you not press us harder?" Ethan looked at him and answered plain. "I told you I was building a second shelter because the first could fail. You called it fear. You called it waste." The man did not argue after that. Spring work still had to be done. Fields needed turning. Fences needed resetting. Life on the prairie did not pause for grief, but something had shifted. When the wind rose, men stopped what they were doing and glanced at the sky longer than before. By late April, the first request came. Caleb Morris rode up one afternoon and tied his horse without knocking. He walked straight to the hillside and stood over the hidden entrance. "Show me where to start," he said. Ethan did not smile. He fetched his tools. They walked along Caleb's property looking for a slope that faced south and stood higher than the creek. Ethan pushed his boot into the soil in several places, testing firmness. He explained that clay held shape better than loose sand. He warned against digging too shallow and against cutting the roof span too wide without enough beams. Caleb listened close. Digging began the next morning. The first 10 feet were the hardest. Breaking through the outer layer took force. Caleb had 2 sons, both strong, and even they slowed after an hour. Earth came out in wheelbarrows dumped downhill. Timber had to be hauled from a grove nearly a mile away. Each beam required shaping to sit flat against packed sod. It was not quick work. It was not easy work. By the 3rd week, blisters covered Caleb's hands. His sons complained. Neighbors rode by and stared but did not stop. Word spread again, this time not of madness, of copying. By summer, 2 more families had started their own projects. Not all designs were the same. Some dug smaller rooms. Some skipped connecting tunnels and built separate entrances disguised with brush and rock. Ethan walked from site to site, correcting mistakes when he saw them. "Do not dig straight up for the vent," he told one man. "Angle it. Wind will drive snow down a vertical pipe. Brace your beams closer together," he told another. "Snow weighs more than you think when it settles." He did not charge money. He did not claim authority. He simply shared what he had learned, nearly dying twice. Not everyone joined. Thomas Bell, a proud farmer whose cabin had survived with minor damage, refused the idea outright. "I will not live like a mole," he said at the general store. "If my house fails, then it fails. I will not bury myself in dirt because of one storm." Some nodded at that. Ethan said nothing. Summer passed into fall. Fields yielded decent harvest despite the late start, but the memory of December remained sharp. No one forgot the sound of roofs breaking. In October, frost came early again. Old men at the store spoke of patterns. When winter arrived early 2 years in a row, it rarely softened. By November, 5 dugouts stood hidden along the ridge outside Cedar Bluff. They did not look like much from a distance. A patch of earth slightly smoother than the rest. A rock placed where no rock had been before. Grass growing thicker in one small square. To strangers, nothing unusual. To those who knew, insurance. Ethan inspected each one before cold settled deep. He checked airflow by holding a small flame near vent openings. He felt for drafts in tunnels. He instructed families to store water in covered barrels underground so it would not freeze solid. Then December returned. Not as violent as the previous year at first. Snow fell steady but calm. Temperatures dipped below zero and stayed there. Men watched their roofs. They kept shovels near doors. On the 12th of January, the wind changed. It came from the northwest again, hard and dry. Snow lifted off the ground and moved sideways like smoke. By evening, cabins along the ridge groaned under pressure. Thomas Bell's house was first to lose shingles. He fought it through the night, climbing onto the roof with a rope tied around his waist while his wife held the other end inside. He hammered boards where he could. The wind tore too free before he climbed down. By midnight, drifting snow pushed through gaps and began to gather in corners. Thomas remembered what he had said in the store months before. He remembered laughing. At 2 in the morning, he pounded on Caleb Morris's door. Caleb opened without surprise. "Bring your blankets," Caleb said. "We go below." They moved into the dugout together. Thomas's pride stayed above in the snow. 3 other families used their underground rooms that night. Not because their cabins had failed yet, but because they could feel the limits being tested again. For 2 days, wind battered the ridge. 2 roofs collapsed. No one died. When the storm ended, the difference was clear. Cabins without backup suffered heavy damage. Cabins with dugouts lost beams but not lives. Thomas Bell stood beside Ethan after the storm and spoke without defense. "You were not hiding from anything, were you?" Ethan shook his head. "Just from the wind." Thomas nodded slowly. That winter marked a change beyond Cedar Bluff. Travelers carried the story to nearby settlements. Some dismissed it as luck. Others asked for measurements and advice. Ethan found himself explaining the same principle again and again. Wood fights air. Earth resists it. You cannot stop wind, but you can remove yourself from its reach. By the spring of 1878, 11 dugouts existed within 20 miles of town. Not every family used them each winter. Some never did. But the knowledge alone shifted how people thought about shelter. Cabins were no longer seen as final answers. They were first layers. Ethan rebuilt his own roof thicker, using doubled beams and heavier cross bracing. But he did not remove the tunnel behind the false wall. He kept it clean. He kept it ready. The Prairie would always test wood, and he had already chosen what he trusted when wood failed. The third winter after the Great Blizzard did not begin with wind. It began with quiet. By late November, the Prairie lay under a hard white crust. Snow from earlier storms had frozen into ridges across the open fields. The sky stayed pale for days at a time. No heavy clouds, no warning signs, just a deep cold that settled in and refused to lift. Ethan Caldwell watched the barometer he kept hanging near his stove. It had dropped slow and steady for 3 days, not sharp enough to alarm the others yet, but enough to tell him pressure was shifting in a way he did not like. He walked the ridge that afternoon, checking vent caps on the dugouts he had helped design. He cleared drift from one entrance. He adjusted the stone around another stovepipe where frost had built up thick along the edge. He did not announce danger. He simply made sure everything was ready. By nightfall, the temperature had fallen to 20 below. Not unusual, but the air felt wrong. Still, air on the Prairie could be worse than wind. When cold air settled without movement, it pooled in low ground and crept into every hollow. Cabins trapped it like bowls. At sunrise, the frost inside Ethan's main cabin clung to the corners of the walls despite a strong fire. His breath formed clouds in front of his face. The stove worked hard. The woodpile shrank faster than it should have. By noon, the temperature had dropped past 30 below, and the wind had still not arrived. That frightened him more than noise would have. He walked to town and found men gathered near the general store, stamping their boots against frozen boards. Conversation was tight and short. Everyone felt the same pressure in the air. The old men spoke in low tones. When the cold comes first like this, wind follows. They were right. It came that night without warning. No slow build, no gentle rise, just a sudden blast that hit the ridge like a wall. Shutters ripped from hinges. Smoke from chimneys flattened sideways. Snow lifted from the crusted ground and filled the air so thick it looked like white smoke rolling over the land. Inside his cabin, Ethan heard the first long moan of stressed timber. He did not wait this time. He banked the stove, gathered supplies, opened the false wall. He had learned that delay cost time he might not have. Below ground, the dugout felt the same as it had 3 years earlier. Quiet, firm, unmoved by chaos above. But this storm was different. The cold was deeper. The wind was sharper. After 12 hours, ice began forming along the inside of the vent shaft where moist air met the frozen upper section. Ethan noticed the draft slowing. He removed his gloves and reached up with a small iron rod he kept for this purpose. He cleared the narrowing passage carefully, knocking loose thin ice sheets before they could choke airflow. This was something he had not needed before. Every design had limits. Above him, something heavy slammed against his cabin wall. He felt the vibration even underground. By morning, the temperature outside reached 40 below. The wind did not slow. In town, Thomas Bell's rebuilt roof held at first. His new beams, doubled like Ethan had shown him, resisted the pressure. But drifted snow piled against the cabin walls, sealing doors tight. Smoke from his chimney struggled to rise. He made the decision before damage began. He moved his family underground. Other families followed. By the second night, 7 dugouts across the ridge were occupied, not in panic, in practice. Children lay on blankets near small stoves. Women stirred pots of beans. Men sat near vent openings, checking airflow and clearing ice with rods of their own. Above them, cabins shook. One roof failed entirely, but the family inside had already moved below. Not a single life was lost. The storm lasted 5 full days. When it passed, Cedar Bluff looked battered but alive. That mattered. Men gathered at the ridge once the sky cleared. They did not speak loudly. They did not celebrate. They simply stood and looked at the land that had tried to break them again. Thomas Bell stepped beside Ethan. "If we had not built them," he said quietly, "we would have buried more this week." Ethan nodded. "It is not about fear," he said. "It is about layers. Wood is one layer, earth is another. When one fails, you move to the next." Word spread farther this time. A trader traveling west carried the story to settlements along the river valley. A rancher from 40 miles south rode up in early spring asking to see the design for himself. He walked through Ethan's dugout slowly, touching the sod walls, testing the beams with his hands. "You carved this by hand?" he asked. "Every foot of it," Ethan answered. The rancher shook his head. "Most men fight winter with more wood. You fought it with dirt." "It was not cleverness," Ethan said. "It was desperation the first time, wisdom the second." By summer of that year, requests for help stretched beyond Cedar Bluff. Ethan could not build for everyone. He began drawing rough diagrams on paper, showing measurements and beam spacing. He wrote short notes explaining why south-facing slopes held less drift and how deep to dig to stay below frost line. Some men followed instructions closely. Others cut corners. One dugout collapsed during construction when beams were spaced too far apart. No one died, but the lesson was sharp. Earth could protect, but only when respected. Ethan made that clear. "This is not magic," he told them. "It is work, hard work, done right or not at all." By the end of that summer, 21 underground shelters existed within a 50-mile stretch of prairie, not hidden from shame anymore, hidden from wind. Cabins still stood above ground. They always would. People needed windows and light and space. But now every family understood something they had once resisted. A single structure was a gamble. A second option was insurance. Ethan did not seek credit. He farmed his land, rebuilt fences, cut timber. When asked for help, he gave it. The prairie did not grow kinder. It simply grew familiar, and familiarity meant preparation. When autumn returned again, Cedar Bluff did not wait for warning signs. Dugouts were cleared, vent shafts tested, wood stacked underground as well as above. The memory of that first cracked beam had changed more than one man's thinking. It had changed a community. And the wind, when it came again in later years, no longer decided who would live and who would freeze. Men still respected it. But they were no longer at its mercy. By the winter of 1881, the ridge outside Cedar Bluff looked ordinary to a stranger. Cabins stood where they always had. Smoke curled from chimneys in thin gray lines. Fences cut across the prairie in straight, stubborn paths. Nothing about the land suggested that beneath several of those homes, rooms of packed earth waited in silence. But the people who lived there knew. They had stopped talking about the dugouts as strange additions. Now they spoke of them the way a man spoke of a spare horse or an extra well bucket. Necessary, quiet, sensible. That year the cold came hard again, but not sudden. It built in layers. First a deep freeze that locked the creek solid. Then a week of wind that drove frost into the cracks of doors and stiffened leather harnesses. Then snow, heavy and wet, the kind that clung to roofs and did not slide off. Ethan Caldwell was older now. Lines marked his face from years of wind and sun. His hands were thicker from labor. He no longer moved with the same speed he had in 1876, but he moved with more certainty. He had improved his own dugout twice since building it. After the second storm, he widened the ventilation shaft slightly and lined part of it with scrap tin to reduce ice buildup. He added a small drainage trench along the back wall that led to a gravel pit he had dug deeper into the slope. Spring meltwater had once seeped in after a sudden thaw. He had corrected that mistake fast. Every improvement came from experience, not theory. In early January, the sky turned the color of dull iron. Old-timers watched the horizon and fell quiet. The wind started at dusk, rising in steady strength instead of sudden violence. Ethan walked the ridge again, checking entrances. He no longer needed to convince anyone to use them. Each family had its own routine now. Supplies were already stored below, blankets folded and stacked, extra kindling sealed in dry sacks. The storm that followed was not as deadly as the first great blizzard, but it was long. 7 days of constant wind, temperatures that dropped to 35 below and held there, snow that drifted high enough to swallow lower windows, cabins strained but did not collapse as often now. Many had been reinforced after lessons learned, beams doubled, roof pitches adjusted steeper to shed weight. Still, even reinforced wood could only endure so much. On the third night of the storm, a sharp crack echoed across the ridge from the northern end. A roof on the Carlson place split near the chimney where heat had weakened one section of timber. The family had already moved underground by then. They heard the collapse as a dull thud above their heads while they sat in steady warmth below. In earlier years, that sound would have meant death. Now it meant inconvenience. After the storm passed, men dug out cabin remains and began repairs. No funerals followed. That fact alone carried weight. Ethan stood with Thomas Bell beside the damaged Carlson house and watched the family haul snow from the doorway. "You changed this place," Thomas said quietly. Ethan shook his head. "The wind changed it. I only paid attention." But attention was rare before. Many had survived early winters by luck and believed luck would continue. Ethan had been the first to distrust that pattern openly. By spring of 1882, nearby settlements had adopted similar ideas. Not identical, but close enough. Some built shallow storm rooms half buried into hills. Others carved storage shelters deeper and reinforced them for habitation during storms. Ranchers farther west began building partial dugouts into the sides of barns, combining livestock warmth with earth insulation. The idea spread not as rumor now, but as practice. Still, resistance lingered in some corners. Pride did not vanish easily on the frontier. One man from a neighboring valley visited Ethan and looked down into the dugout with skepticism. "You live like this by choice?" he asked. Ethan answered without offense. "No, I live above ground by choice. I survive below ground by design." The man studied the beams, the sod walls, the neat stacking of supplies. "And you truly believe the earth is stronger than timber?" he asked. Ethan placed his hand against the packed wall. "Timber bends, timber splits, earth settles and holds, if you build it right." There was no boast in his tone, only fact. That summer, Ethan began writing simple instructions at the request of a county official who had heard of the success on the ridge. The county had lost too many lives in the first blizzard. They wanted fewer graves in future winters. Ethan described slope selection. He explained frost line depth. He listed common mistakes: digging in low ground, ignoring ventilation, spacing beams too wide, neglecting drainage. He emphasized labor, weeks of it. Months sometimes. There were no shortcuts. Some families hired help to speed construction. Others gathered neighbors for shared work, trading labor between homesteads. The building of dugouts became almost communal in certain areas, much like barn raisings. Ethan watched this shift with quiet satisfaction, not because people copied him, because fewer children froze. By 1884, Cedar Bluff had endured 3 more hard winters without a single storm-related death. Cabins still suffered damage. Repairs were constant, but no family faced the wind with only one layer of protection anymore. Ethan rebuilt his own main cabin once more that year, replacing older logs with tighter-fitted ones and improving the chinking between them. He did not rely solely on the dugout. He believed in strengthening the first layer as much as the second. Preparation did not mean hiding. It meant stacking advantages. In town, the laughter that once followed his name had faded into something else. Respect, though few said the word aloud. Children growing up on the ridge thought of the underground rooms as normal. They played near the hidden entrances in summer, knowing those same spaces would shelter them when snow swallowed the fields. The idea had settled into the land. And the land, though still harsh, no longer caught them unready. Ethan sometimes walked to the top of the ridge at dusk and looked over the cabins below. He could not see the dugouts from there. That was the point. Invisible strength. The prairie still tested wood every winter. But now, beneath that wood, quiet rooms of packed earth waited with steady patience. And that patience had begun to outlast the storms. By the late 1880s, Ethan Caldwell's hair had turned mostly gray. The ridge outside Cedar Bluff had changed with him. Where once only one hidden shelter lay beneath the earth, now nearly every homestead had some form of underground refuge. Some were simple storm rooms carved into slopes. Others were full dugout cabins large enough to house entire families for weeks. What had once been whispered about was now discussed openly. Still, not everyone built them well. In the spring of 1887, heavy rains soaked the prairie for nearly 2 straight weeks. The creek swelled and spilled into low ground. One of the newer families, the Martins, had dug their shelter too close to the base of a shallow rise. They had chosen convenience over elevation. Ethan had warned them. When thaw came, water seeped through the packed earth and pooled along the dugout floor. The sod walls softened. One beam shifted slightly out of place. No one was hurt, but the lesson was clear. Earth protected from wind, not from careless planning. Ethan walked the Martins through the repairs himself. They dug a proper drainage trench angled away from the entrance. They reinforced the back wall with tighter sod stacking and replaced the loosened beam. The work took nearly a month. Hard labor built safety. Hard lessons maintained it. That same year, a dry lightning storm set fire to grassland west of town. Flames moved fast across open prairie, pushed by summer wind. Cabins were vulnerable to fire as much as winter. Several families took refuge in their dugouts while men fought the blaze with wet sacks and plowed fire breaks. The underground rooms, sealed and low, offered protection from heat and smoke as well as cold. It was something Ethan had not first intended, but it proved the same principle. Layered shelter was stronger than single shelter. By 1889, the county seat recorded far fewer winter deaths than neighboring regions. Word traveled beyond the immediate settlements now. Travelers from farther territories stopped to ask questions. Some called them earth houses. Others called them storm dens. Ethan preferred no special name. He called them backups. As the years passed, his own use of the dugout grew less frequent. Reinforced cabins and better roofing methods reduced roof failures. Communities learned to clear snow regularly and brace weak sections before storms. But Ethan never removed the tunnel behind the false wall. He checked it each autumn. He cleared spider webs from corners. He replaced worn stovepipe joints. He treated it like an old tool that might not be needed but must never fail. In the winter of 1890, one last severe blizzard swept through the region. Not as deadly as the first one that had changed everything, but fierce enough to remind people of the land's nature. Ethan did not move underground that storm. His rebuilt cabin held steady. But 2 younger families did. Their roofs strained under weight they had misjudged. Instead of waiting for failure, they chose safety early. That decision marked a shift. No one waited for collapse anymore. Preparation had become instinct. When spring arrived after that storm, Ethan walked the ridge slowly, leaning on a stick he had begun carrying for longer distances. He paused near the hidden entrance of his own dugout and rested his hand on the packed earth. He thought of the night he first stepped into it while his roof beam split above him. He thought of the funerals that followed. He thought of the laughter he once endured. Most of the men who had mocked him were gone now. Some buried by storms. Others moved west. A few remained and often sat beside him at the store, speaking calmly about roof bracing and soil testing as if such talk had always been common. Time had softened memory, but Ethan never forgot how narrow the line had once been between survival and death. He continued farming until his body no longer allowed heavy work. In 1892, he sold part of his land to a young couple starting their homestead. Before signing the deed, he walked them to the hillside and showed them the hidden entrance. "You keep this clear," he told them, "even if you think you will never use it." They nodded. He could see in their eyes that they understood. They had grown up in a county shaped by underground shelter. To them, it was not strange. It was normal. Ethan moved into town later that year to live near his daughter. Age had slowed him, but his mind remained sharp. He still spoke at gatherings when asked about early winters. He never dramatized the story. He spoke plainly of wind load, snow weight, and the way cold could strip heat from a structure faster than men believed possible. In 1895, another harsh cold snap struck the region. News reached him that no one on the ridge had died. Several families had used their dugouts during that storm. He sat quietly on the porch outside his daughter's house when he heard that report. He did not smile wide. He simply nodded once. That was enough. When he passed away 2 years later, his name was spoken with respect across Cedar Bluff. Not because he had been the strongest man, not because he had been the loudest, because he had prepared when others trusted luck. The hillside where his first dugout stood remained undisturbed for decades. Families maintained it out of habit, even as newer building methods improved cabins. Some eventually filled their own shelters in as years of mild winters passed. But the memory stayed. Layer your protection. Never trust one wall alone. Storms would always return. And when they did, those who had learned the lesson from a gray-haired farmer who once dug into a hillside would not face the wind with empty hands. By the early 1900s, Cedar Bluff no longer looked like a struggling frontier outpost. The town had grown. A rail spur passed within 10 miles. Lumber arrived milled and straight instead of hand-cut from creek bottoms. Tin roofing replaced many of the old wooden shingles. Some homes even had small glass windows shipped in from the east. From a distance, it might have seemed that the hard lessons of earlier winters were no longer needed, but the ridge remembered. The first generation who had survived the Great Blizzard told their children about roofs collapsing under snow that sounded soft at first. They described the way wind could pry warmth out of a cabin even when a stove burned full. They spoke of neighbors who had believed wood alone was enough, and they pointed to the hillsides. Some dugouts were still in use. Others had been converted into storage. A few were filled in as families felt safer with improved construction methods. Yet even when a shelter was abandoned, its outline remained faintly visible in the way grass grew thicker along one section of slope. The idea had taken root deeper than the rooms themselves. In 1903, a hard winter struck again, colder than most expected. The new cabins held better than the old log houses had, but the wind did not care about improvements. Snow piled heavy. One large ranch house lost part of its roof near the chimney. The family inside did not hesitate. They moved into their old dugout, built 20 years earlier by a father who had once been told he was wasting time. They stayed there for 3 days. No one died. By then, the lesson had become tradition. Ethan Caldwell's original dugout remained intact for years after his passing. The young couple who bought his land kept it maintained through 2 more winters. Eventually, as milder seasons passed and new building methods improved insulation, they used it less. In 1921, after a stretch of easier winters, the property changed hands. The new owner viewed the underground room as unnecessary and slightly dangerous. He worried about children wandering into it. He filled the entrance with packed soil and removed the visible vent pipe. Within a season, grass covered the spot. From the outside, nothing remained, but memory does not erase as quickly as earth. Old photographs taken around 1890 still showed a patch of hillside with a faint line where the entrance once lay hidden. A small stone cluster marking the disguised vent could be seen if one knew where to look. The dugout itself might be gone. The principle was not. Across the prairie, variations of that idea endured. Storm cellars became common. Root cellars were reinforced to double as shelters. Ranchers carved partial living spaces into slopes near barns to share warmth with livestock. Later generations poured concrete into the earth for tornado shelters, following the same thinking without always knowing where it began. Build where wind cannot reach. Trust mass over motion. Layer your protection. The frontier did not teach kindness. It taught consequence. Those who ignored warning signs paid for it. Those who studied patterns survived longer. Ethan Caldwell had not invented earth sheltering. Others before him in different lands had lived partly underground for centuries. But in Cedar Bluff, on that exposed ridge of prairie, he had been the first to insist that visible strength was not always enough. He had understood something simple and uncomfortable. Wood is temporary. Wind is patient. Earth endures. Modern homes now stand on the same plains where his cabin once shook under a splitting beam. They are built with better insulation, stronger framing, and improved roofing materials. Yet even today, in regions battered by blizzards and high winds, builders anchor structures deeper. They reinforce basements. They create safe rooms below ground. The reasoning remains unchanged. When exposed shelter reaches its limit, retreat below it. What once looked like paranoia became common sense. The people who once laughed learned that storms do not negotiate with pride. They test structure. They test preparation. They test whether a man built for average weather or worst-case weather. Ethan built for the worst. He paid for it in labor, in isolation, and in reputation. But when the beam cracked and the roof failed, he did not face the storm with only hope. He stepped into earth that did not shake. He lived long enough to see others follow. And though the hillside that once hid his dugout now shows no sign of what lay beneath it, the ridge it protected still stands. Every winter wind that sweeps across that prairie passes over soil that once saved lives. And somewhere in that wind is the quiet reminder that survival rarely belongs to the loudest builder. It belongs to the one who prepares when others still laugh.